Every year in Colombia, hundreds of pieces of legislation are introduced. You and I hear about a handful, maybe a little more than a handful, but basically a handful of the ones that everyone seems to think are important. Restaurant carry, school choice, the Department of Administration, ethics reform, mental health reform, tax code reform. These are the things we hear about. But below that, there are hundreds of pieces of legislation that never make it out of committee or that don't get out of the House or the Senate. And occasionally they might sneak through and get signed by the governor, but they're not considered important enough for us to all know about them. Which means that every year there is what I call a bag of other legislation that we never hear about. And so what I'm going to do is every once in a while I'm going to reach into that bag and pull out a piece of the other legislation and talk about it because it's funny or it's interesting or it's tragic or it's something that we actually need to get behind and do something. So from time to time I'm going to do that. Today's piece of other legislation is not something we necessarily have to get behind and push. Not really tragic. It's interesting to me. And it deals with alligators. Legislation in the State House right now dealing with alligators. But let's do a little quick background. Alligators were one of the first species put on the endangered species list back in 1973. But because of the protection and their actions, they were actually taken off the endangered species list in 1987 because of their increased numbers. South Carolina still kept it illegal to hunt wild alligators until 2008 when they released a few tags for hunters to hunt the alligators and sell their hides, not the meat. It's illegal to sell wild alligator meat, I believe, anywhere in the country. Now you're like, hold on a second, Eric. I've eaten alligator at a restaurant, or I know someone who buys alligator on a regular basis. And you do. Those aren't wild gators. Those are gators from a farm. Yes, a gator farm. Not old McDonald's, a gator farm. In Louisiana, Florida, and Georgia, there are gator farms. And all the gator meat we get here in South Carolina comes from those farms. Now, one of our good senators, Brad Hutto from Orangeburg, has decided that maybe South Carolina needs to get in the game with gator farms. And he has introduced Senate 714, which is a bill that would authorize the Department of Natural Resources to regulate and help create gator farms in South Carolina, where people could raise gators to sell for their hides and for meat, so that you and I can get our gator fix, get our gator chops from Bilo. Now, hold on. Before you run out to Bilo to go grab them, you gotta wait some time. It's gonna take, if this passed today, which is still in committee and it's nowhere near, but if it passed today, it would take about 3 years for a gator farmer to have a harvest. Because gator farming is not really that easy, from what I can understand. It takes a huge commitment of money up front. It takes you've got to find the food to feed these creatures so that they grow. For example, to get a gator to about 6 to 7 feet long, it's going to take you over 400 pounds of protein. Now, there are some tweaks that farmers in Louisiana, Florida, and Georgia have done to speed up the process. For example, you need to get animals to grow quickly. So, because gators have a natural dormancy in cold weather, on the farms, they heat the water so they don't go into that dormancy. Also, gators can go a long time, sometimes months, without actually eating. But in the farms, they kind of keep that protein flowing in there to keep those animals eating, so that they can take a gator hatchling from hatchling to 6 or 7 feet in about 3 years. Now that would normally take 6 to 8 in the wild. So even with the tweaking, it's going to be a couple years before there's any gator meat at your local grocery store. But you know, I was thinking about those tweaks, and I remember a protest out in front of McDonald's about how the chickens were treated that were used for the chicken nuggets. And it was pretty graphic protest. They had a couple women in bikinis in a glass coffin filled with fake blood, and they were laying in there, and it was, you know, they were protesting the treatment. And I've seen other things about chickens kept in the cages and the farm situation. And I never had thought about it as much until I started reading this article about gators. Now, this isn't something, we don't already have gator meat, you know, gator nuggets at McDonald's. You don't normally order gator chops when you go out to eat. So I'm wondering, you know, I understand the revenue thing, but you know what? It's not actually a very profitable business. In Florida, since 1977, they've had 65 farm licenses, but only 10 were active this past year, or actually in 2012. And depending on the price going for hide, I think they said in 2012 these farms were getting about $500 per gator. So I'm wondering, as much as this is interesting, and I would like to try some gator nuggets, some gator ribs. I saw some pictures on the internet of some pretty tasty looking food. I'm wondering, do we really need to mess with Mother Nature and farm these animals? Do we not have enough meat to eat, variety of meats to eat now, that we need to tweak with the biology of alligators? It's an interesting bill. It's an interesting piece of legislation. It's Senate 714. It's just in committee now. The details haven't been worked out. If you think you would like to see a gator farming in South Carolina, contact Senator Brad Hutto, and maybe he can give you some details. Maybe you can support it. If you're like me, I don't think I need gator meat. If I do, I'll buy it from Georgia or Florida or Louisiana. We can find industry other ways. We can find money and jobs in other areas besides tweaking with how God created the creatures out there in the world. So that's been a bill from the bag of other legislation, just an interesting piece of legislation. Our next podcast for Another Voice with Eric and Friends comes this coming Tuesday, the 18th. We are going to be interviewing Star Hammond with Love Local of the Upstate. We're going to be talking about domestic violence and nonpartisan elections and some other things. So you can find that at canigetawordin.com. You can also go to Facebook at Another Voice with Eric and Friends. You can check out the YouTube on our YouTube channel at Be Another Voice, and the Twitter at Be Another Voice. All right, until we speak again, get out in your community and make a difference.